You think of the Vikings as warriors, axes, shields, long, but their true power wasn't in battle. It was in what they did after the killing stopped. Imagine your husband's blood cooling in the dirt, your home in flames, then the warriors turned to you. Their rituals weren't victory, they were desecration. And what followed would scar generation. The Viking Age carved its name into history with steel and fire. But conquest meant more than land or treasure. It meant the deliberate breaking of people. And no one bore the weight of this cruelty more than the wives of the conquered, whose fates revealed the darkest truths of Viking war. History isn't dead, it's just buried beneath silence. Like, share, comment, and subscribe if you're ready to keep digging with us. But be warned, some truths bite back. The conqueror's oath. When a Viking longship slid onto the shore, it carried more than warriors. It carried a promise. Before battle, men swore oaths to their gods, vowing to drench the earth not only with blood but with humiliation. Victory wasn't counted in corpses alone. It was counted in how completely they crushed the spirit of their enemy. Once a village fell, the slaughter of men was only the beginning. The real conquest began with the survivors. For the Vikings, the most prized trophies were not coins, not weapons, not even land. They were women, wives of the slain. To strip them away was to mutilate a man's honor, to continue the killing beyond death. Imagine the aftermath. The last warrior collapsing into silence, the air thick with smoke and iron. The raiders turned their gaze to the wives left behind. Dragged into the center of the village, women were forced to stand while laughter circled them like wolves. Names erased, families erased, humanity erased. Their suffering became theater. Their cries were not pitied, they were celebrated, proof of power. The cruelty was deliberate, structured, almost ritualistic. Leaders declared these women to be gifts of the gods, twisting their torment into a holy act. To the Vikings, taking them was not only acceptable, it was sacred duty. It wasn't chaos, it was worship. War blurred into religion, and the wives of enemies became sacrifices, living altars to domination. And there was no escape. Once seized, these women rarely saw freedom again. Their fate was sealed the moment the longship's prow touched shore. What happened in those first hours was only the beginning of a journey darker than death itself, because the battlefield was only the first stage of horror. The sea was waiting, and it would carry them into an even deeper abyss. The ship of shadows to be seized by Vikings was to be stolen not only from your home but from the very world you knew. Once the smoke cleared and the raiders packed their loot, the wives of the slain were dragged toward the longship. Those vessels, elegant to an outsider's eye, became cages for the captured. The moment the women stepped aboard, freedom ended. Shackles bit into their wrists, rope burned into their skin. They were forced below, into the narrow, suffocating space between the ribs of the ship. The planks reeked of salt and rot, stained with dried blood from raids past. Every creak of timber was a reminder that escape was impossible. The sea stretched endless in all directions. Days blurred into nights, though there was little difference in the belly of the vessel. Darkness pressed against them, broken only by the muffled sound of waves slapping the hull and the relentless rhythm of oars pounding like war drums. Hunger gnawed, thirst choked, and sleep came in shreds, shattered by the drunken roars of men above deck. Survivors later described women being chained together, forced to share every misery, hunger, humiliation, and violation. Some were branded with heated iron, scarred deliberately so no one could mistake them for anything other than property. Others were paraded in front of the crew, mocked and degraded. Their pain a cruel form of entertainment during the endless voyage. The ocean itself conspired against them. Storms threw the ship like a toy, salt water pouring into the hold where women struggled to breathe, clinging to one another in terror. In that prison of wood and iron, tears had no meaning, only endurance did. And yet, even as they prayed for rescue, the women knew the sea was not their deliverance. It was only a bridge, carrying them farther from home and deeper into their captor's world. Each passing day stripped them of more than dignity, it stripped them of identity. They were not wives anymore, not daughters, not mothers. They were spoils, evidence of Viking strength. When the longship finally reached its destination, the wives were hauled ashore like cargo. Their ordeal on the water was over. But what awaited them on land would prove even more grotesque, because once a Viking returned home, his spoils had to be displayed, inspected, and sold. The nightmare of the ship was only a prelude to the market of flesh. The flesh market, the longship's voyage ended not with freedom, but with a spectacle. When Vikings returned home, they carried more than gold and weapons. They carried proof of dominance, and that proof was paraded in markets where enemies' wives became currency. Imagine the scene: a crowded square, the smell of fish and smoke thick in the air. At the center, the women are lined up, forced to stand before strangers, some stripped bare, others reduced to rags, their bodies displayed like cattle awaiting slaughter. Buyers walk past with cold eyes, tugging at hair, prying mouths open to inspect teeth, pinching flesh as if testing livestock. Every gesture reduced them further, every glance confirming they were no longer human, they were inventory. The humiliation was deliberate. These were not random captives, but wives of the defeated. Their suffering was theater, their degradation a message to all who watched. This is what happens when you defy the norm. A chieftain's wife, once clothed in honor, now sold at the price of a goat. That reversal of fortune was more valuable than any silver coin. It was psychological warfare played out in the open. Some women were bought by merchants to be sent along the vast Viking trade routes, stretching as far as the slave markets of the Middle East. Their names and pasts were erased entirely, swallowed by foreign lands. Others were claimed for brothels, their bodies used until they collapsed from exhaustion or disease. Death became the only release. For those kept closer to home, the nightmare was slower. Enslaved in households, they ground grain until their hands bled, fetched water until their backs broke, and were forced to bear children to the very men who had murdered their kin. Even motherhood, the most sacred of roles, became a prison. Was the child in their arms a comfort, or a living scar of their captor's violence? And the darkest irony, among Vikings, these acts were celebrated. To break an enemy so completely that his wife served your table or warmed your bed was not seen as shameful. It was seen as honorable. A story to boast about over meat, proof of divine favor. The women may have survived the sea, but here in the market, survival meant surrender. Their past lives ended with the swing of an axe. Their future was written in the cold eyes of strangers bidding on their bodies. But not all wives were meant to be sold. Some were marked for a different fate, one far more horrifying, where their suffering would be offered not to men, but to the gods themselves. The blood sacrifice for some women, the market never came. Their fate was not to be sold or enslaved, but to be offered. In the Viking world, war was never only about men, it was about gods, and the wives of enemies sometimes became sacrifices in ceremonies meant to please those gods. The rituals were chilling. Chroniclers from Fair of Lands wrote of women chosen for offerings after raids, elected not for survival, but for death. They were plied with mead or strange herbs until their minds slipped into haze. Intoxication wasn't mercy, it was a tool, making their bodies pliant and their screams less coherent, their will drained before the ritual even began. Then came the parade. Women were displayed before the community, their dignity stripped as neighbors, strangers, and captors looked on. The greater their beauty, the greater the cruelty. For to the Vikings, destroying what was most admired made the sacrifice more powerful, more satisfying to the gods. Whispers and sagas tell of executions twisted into theater. Some women were strangled with ropes dyed red, their last gasps mistaken for songs to Odin. Others were drowned in rivers, their bodies offered to Njord, the sea god, as if the water could cleanse the stain of war. And there are darker tales still of the infamous Blood Eagle. Whether myth or truth, the Blood Eagle endures as a symbol of Viking savagery. Victims were bound, their ribs hacked from the spine, their lungs pulled out and spread like grotesque wings. Some say this was done to warriors alone, but imagine the terror of a wife forced into such a fate. Her body turned into a spectacle of suffering while chants rose to the sky. Even if rare, the mere rumor of it was enough to shatter the courage of any who dared resist. Not every sacrifice was so theatrical. Some women were buried alive beside their captors, sealed in the earth as unwilling companions into the afterlife. Others burned on pyres, their screams swallowed by smoke as onlookers declared the gods had been fed. What unites these stories is not whether every detail is true, but what they reveal of Viking psychology. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were staged, public. They were messages carved into flesh and memory. Resist, and your wives will not just be stolen. They will be consumed. The gods may have been appeased, but for the women who survived, the torment was only beginning. because survival itself became the cruelest sentence of all. The ghosts who lived survival might sound like mercy, but for the wives who lived, survival was its own curse. Death ended suffering. Life stretched it across years. Imagine being carried into a Viking household after the raid, your wrists raw from rope, your body aching from the voyage. You are given no name, only a role. Slave, concubine, servant. Every day is labor. Every night a reminder of what was taken from you. You prepare meals for the man who killed your husband. You clean the hands that still smell of blood. You lie awake listening to his breathing, wondering if he dreams of the slaughter that brought him to you. For some women, motherhood was forced upon them. They bore children not of love, but of violation. And here lies the most twisted cruelty. Those children were often raised as Vikings, molded into the very culture that destroyed their mothers' lives. To nurse a child that carries the face of your captor was to live with a wound that never closed. Was the baby in your arms an innocent soul or a living scar? That question gnawed endlessly. Others became invisible within Viking society, shadows in the corners of longhouses, their voices silenced. They were not celebrated, not remembered, not even mourned. To the victors, they were property. To history, they were shame. Their names vanished from records, their graves unmarked, their existence erased as if they had never lived yet. Every silent act of endurance was a scream swallowed by time. And still, they linger, not in sagas or songs, but in the gaps, whispers of despair carried across generations. Folklore in distant villages speaks of women who cursed the Northmen, who carried their hatred like embers, passing it on in bitter prayers. Their suffering didn't end with them. It haunted their children, their children's children, shaping how whole communities remembered the terror of the raids. This was the final triumph of the Vikings. They didn't just break bodies, they broke lineage, memory, identity itself. The wives of enemies lived on as ghosts, forced to walk through life hollow, their silence louder than any battle cry. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. Not the blood spilled on battlefields, not the screams torn from throats in sacrifice, but the quiet agony of women condemned to live, forgotten by history, yet forever trapped in its shadows. If this story left a mark, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe for more disturbing tales, forgotten deaths, and the grotesque truths history tried to bury. Because the past doesn't sleep, and neither should we.